recognize the way that this changes you, recognize the benefit of these things. So don't be stuck going backwards. And I think that's a kind of big takeaway in all of this is there's this underlying assumption of the power of the gospel and the way that it can change us as people. Doesn't mean that we're perfect all of a sudden, that we no longer have the same sort of temptations and sin as people before us, but I do think it does fundamentally change us. And I think that we are robbing ourselves of the power of God when we minimize the effects of that change that can take place in us. It's like when I'm with my kids and I try to show them something, like, I can't do it. It's like, well, yes, you can. They're like, no, I can't. I'm like, yeah, you can. Like, I was trying to show Caleb how to play like a C chord on a ukulele. It's the easiest thing in the world. He's never done it before, so he's like, I can't do it. And I'm like, yeah, you can, bud. And I try to show him. He's like, I can't do it. And he stops and like leaves. And it's like, well, that's not true, because I've seen videos of 3-year-olds like playing crazy stuff on a ukulele. Like, you may not be like some sort of savant, but I'm pretty sure you could figure out how to put one finger on one string and go like this. Like, that's all I'm asking, bud. But I can't do it. And so he's limited himself because he's decided he can't do it. We shouldn't do that with the gospel and the way that it can change us and who we can become. I think sometimes we are afraid of the changes that can actually take place in us. I mean, you hear the stories all the time of people who have radically changed their lives because of the gospel. It is a huge, powerful thing that can affect us. So that's one of the kind of takeaways from there. Any other comments, questions? So this is maybe a little bit of a, hopefully this is an interesting conversation. One of the things that I think about when I look at the way that he uses Hagar and Sarah as an allegory here is, what does that mean for us in terms of our interpretation of the Old Testament? Does this empower us then to do the same sort of thing that Paul's doing, to be able to go to the Old Testament and start, coming up with these arguments? Because without this, I don't know that I ever would have thought of Hagar and Sarah in these terms. And so one of the difficult things when you're a preacher or teacher or Bible student, just in general, is you start looking at the New Testament and the way they use the Old Testament, and you wonder, what does that mean, right? Like, how does that affect me? And so it's like, is it typology? Is it teaching us to look for types that we can kind of pattern ourselves after? Is it all allegory that we can allegorize or anything like that? And so that gets tricky, and it's a hard thing to determine. My stance on all of that is, one, I think that the Bible is complete, and I think that the interpretation and the interpretation of the Old Testament that exists in the New Testament is all we need. I don't know that we need to be trying to create our own sorts of arguments from the Old Testament, creating our own allegories from stories and teaching them. I think the Bible is complete. I don't know that we have to do that. And I think that we are well suited just sticking to the way that the New Testament writers use the Old Testament. I think we get ourselves a lot of trouble if we don't do that. The other part of that, about this is, I think part of what Paul is doing, like I said, is he's reversing their argument against them. I don't think that he's trying to set a precedent for us to be able to go to the Old Testament and start allegorizing everything that occurs. There are clearly types that exist from the Old Testament to the New. Jesus is a type of Israel, and Matthew makes that clear in the first few chapters, right? The Israelites were in Egypt. They had to flee to Egypt, and they came out, and then they were baptized by crossing through the Red Sea, and then they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And Matthew's story starts with him going to Egypt, then he's baptized, and then he's 40 days tempted in the wilderness. And then he teaches on the mountain like they received the law at Sinai. And so Matthew is setting up a type. Jesus is the fulfillment of what the Israelites couldn't fulfill. Seems to be his point there. So that's interesting, right? Those types exist. Or Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac is a type of Christ. We see those things. But I don't know that the point is for us to be able to go to the Old Testament and start cleverly trying to devise our own way to fit things into something else. Maybe that's something I don't need to say. Maybe that's an uninteresting argument. But I know at least in scholarly world, you start reading these books, and people like to make all sorts of assumptions about the way that this applies to this, and this looks like that, and so you could say this, and they get themselves lost in the wilderness of interpretation because they're so clever at being able to tie things together. I think that there is a way to do that. I think the Bible does teach us how to do some of that stuff, but I do kind of think that there should be some caution there. So maybe that's a side argument that we didn't need to bring up, but I thought it was interesting. Anybody want to talk about that? Yeah.
Since the writer, since Paul used it here as an example, it's perfectly legal and okay for us to use it as an example because it's right here in the New Testament.
Right.
And it's an example for us.
Yep.
And if it works, apply it.
Yep.
If it doesn't, don't twist it out of shape to make it fit.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that Paul has shown us that this is an example to use. I think that we are certainly authorized to repeat the arguments that are in the New Testament. Like I said, maybe that wasn't worth bringing up, but those are the sorts of stuff I think about all the time, so I thought I'd throw it out there for conversation. But yeah.
You know, I think that you definitely get yourself lost in it, but I think that on the other hand, what seems to be Jesus' interpretation of the old scriptures, that all points to him anyway. It's that he's fulfilling it, and it's almost like it's in your face the entire time you're reading the Old Testament anyway.
Yeah.
And so it makes me wonder, on the other hand, how much of it is clearly pointing to Jesus the entire time that I should be getting it, and start reading the scriptures in that way, where it's pointing me in the direction to Christ, not necessarily getting lost in the weeds, chasing the rabbits, going somewhere else.
Yeah.
But all of it is instructive to point towards the New Testament and fulfillment of it.
Right, and in fact, I think Jesus himself says that. You know, like all Scripture is pointing towards that moment in the Messiah and stuff. I think the bigger lesson is in when it comes to other sorts of applications and arguments and doctrines and things like that people try to make outside of Jesus being the fulfillment of all things. So I think you're right. I think that's well said.
I think it's just an example he's showing from the old way to the new way.
Yeah. Yeah. Jesus is the fulfillment of all those things. Yeah.
I think that's just all that is just an example.
Yeah. So here's another kind of any other comments? Sorry. Here's another kind of application thing from all this, because with Galatians, he's dealing so much with these specific arguments of Judaizers and Christianity and all that stuff. So I think it's important to try and back up and look at some of the applications of these things. And so when we look at Hagar and Sarah and this particular argument that he's making, the question is, are you the bondwoman or of the free, right? Like which heritage do you have is the question. And so what does that look like? What is the application there from those things? And again, this is the sort of thing that I think is fascinating, because you will hear, at least I have heard, people regularly talk about Church of Christ, Conservative Church of Christ, and say that we are Pharisaical, right? That we do the same things that the Pharisees have done because we try to come up with these specific rules that you have to follow, otherwise you are lost. And they'll point to things like instrumental music, or they'll point to other sorts of doctrinal stances that we take and say, see, you're caring too much about the jods and the tittles and not as much about the heart of the law. And they'll try and make these arguments about that stuff. And so I think that when you look at the slave and the free, they might look at those arguments and say, see, free, you are set at liberty, you're trying to go back to the old law, that's all you're trying to do, you're trying to box yourself in as opposed to recognizing the liberty that you have in Christ or something like that. I don't think that's the right way to apply this at all, obviously. I don't agree with that. I hope you all know that. I mean, I'm preaching in a Conservative Church of Christ, so hopefully I agree with our stances on things. I think that that's a miscalculation of what he's saying here, right? Like, that's not the point of the argument here. It isn't about whether or not you are following the 5 steps to salvation and whether or not you are searching the Scriptures to do what God desires. That's clearly not the application here. The difference is how your heart is emboldened by those things. So the way that I think about it is like this. If you are desiring to do the things of God, if you have been transformed by the blood of the Lamb, if you've been baptized and buried and raised to walk in newness of life, and you care and seek truth, then you're going to seek truth, right? And you're going to pursue righteousness as a matter of course. And so part of that pursuit is you're going to do the things that the Bible has shown you to be right and shown to be the right way to do things. And so that's not the same thing at all as taking people and pushing them back to the old law that has clearly been fulfilled, through Jesus. And so, again, maybe it's not worth bringing up, but it seems to me like people use those kind of reverse arguments sometimes against us because they don't like the fact that we are particular. They don't like that we are careful. They don't like that we care and study and try to pursue righteousness with such fervor. And so they try to find a way to undercut our stance on those things. I don't think that that's the case at all. I mean, I think rather we are pursuing the very righteousness that God has shown in all ways, to build each other up to love and good works, right? To sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in our hearts, right? That we are bearing the fruit of the Spirit and all those things. Now, if we were to lose the love, joy, peace, patience, hope, faithfulness, and instead have the form, then we are lost, right? But that's clearly two separate issues, right? It isn't about one or the other. It's about having all of these things as you pursue God and the way that you were transformed. So, any comments, questions about that? A couple hands popped up quickly. Brent.
Not about that, but just another application that comes out of this is he's definitely showing that you want to be the free woman and not the bond woman. And the religion of Islam completely swaps that, and they rewrite the Old Testament story to make Ishmael the son of promise. And everything that happens to Isaac, they rewrite to happen to Ishmael. And then they try to throw Christ in there, and in Galatians here, it just falls all apart. The way they rewrite the Old Testament in their Quran, and it's kind of funny how it all falls apart there.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, Don?
Well, I was going to say, no matter what we do, what we think of ourselves, we're saved by faith, saved by grace through faith. And it's God's grace is why we are saved, not of ourselves. And yes, you can do a lot of good works, but you never wear them on your sleeves as badges of honor. You're saved because God loves us, period. And you've seen people who wear their good works as badges of honor in churches. We can't do that. We are all saved by grace through faith, obedient faith in Jesus Christ. And yet Jesus Christ, 1 John says, if you love me, keep my commandments, which means we do our very best to do our very best.
Right.
And we leave it at that. And anyone who criticizes that doesn't understand that principle of Jesus Christ, period. Doesn't understand that principle of the gospel.
Right. Saved by Jesus. And part of that salvation is the change that takes place in us because of it. And the change isn't the thing that saves us. We are saved and changed. They go hand in hand, right? We are saved by the grace of God and by what He's done for us. But there is this change that takes place in those that are saved too. And it isn't the works that saves us. It is Jesus and His love and His sacrifice. So I referenced Isaiah 51, where thoughts, comments, questions before we finish. Appreciate your all's attention tonight. We'll pick up chapter 5 next week.
She'll text you, don't you worry.
Revive us again. 37. We praise thee, O God, for the Son of thy love, for Jesus who died and is now gone above. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Revive us again. We praise thee, O God, for the Spirit of life, who has shown us our Savior and scattered our night. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Revive us again. All glory and praise to the Lamb that was slain, who has borne all our sins and has cleansed every stain. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Revive us again. The number 360 will be the song of encouragement tonight. 360.
Good evening. If you would, open up your Bibles to Revelation chapter 21. Revelation chapter 21, that's where we'll be in just a moment. I appreciate everything you do, Jason, and I will certainly miss the thought experiments. I love those challenging thoughts that you give us, so we'll miss that for sure. And I want to do something a little bit different this evening as an invitation. I want to encourage you to be looking at the New Jerusalem that we were just talking about a little bit ago. So if we were here not last Sunday, but the Sunday before, we had a song service focused around the idea of heaven and on this New Jerusalem, and we were reading through some different passages talking about heaven, and we were singing songs about heaven, and your mind was focused on heaven. It's just such an encouraging thing to be looking towards, and it really just juices you up, ready to keep going for the next day because heaven's on your mind. So I want you to think of that tonight with me for a moment. And so we were reading Revelation chapter 21. And if you read with me here in verse 9, I will just read a little bit with you. Then came one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls full of the 7 last plagues and spoke to me, saying, Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great high mountain and showed me the holy city Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, having the glory of God, its radiance like a most rare jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. If you go down to verse 15 with me. And the one who spoke with me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city and its gates and walls. The city lies 4 its length the same as its width. And he measured the city with his rod, 12,000 stadia. Its length and width and height are equal. All right, I'll pause there because this is what I want to talk about. When I read it on Sunday, I marched right on past 12,000 stadia, having no idea what a stadia was, and we kept going on to read the rest of it. Well, the engineering mind in myself, thinking about it the next day, was like, okay, how big is 12,000 stadia? All right, so John's seeing this image of heaven, right? And he's trying to put it in terms that I can understand, and yet I have no idea what a stadia is, right? So I think this is, of course, a vision. It's a dream. It's not necessarily literal. Heaven probably isn't exactly 12,000 stadia long, but I want you to have the picture that John's trying to relay to you of what 12,000 stadia is like. So
I did the math on it. And so I'm giving you all of the math here for a second, just so that way it might impress upon you just how big this is, right? The great, big, grand Jerusalem coming down out of heaven with the glory of God and the radiance of God coming out of heaven. You are looking up to see it, and he sees 12,000 stadia long, wide, and high. Well, how big is that? Well, 12,000 stadia, it would be 1,380 miles. So 1,380 miles for a city, not a nation, not an earth, for a city. So if you were to drive on interstate speed, going 70 miles an hour, going all the way down, you start in one corner of the city, you went all the way to the other end of the city, it would take you 19 hours and 45 minutes, okay, to get down one side of the city of this New Jerusalem. All right, so let me give you an example of the layout then. If we put 4 corners on it, think that you start in Tallahassee and you go all the way to LA, all the way up to Seattle, all the way back to Ohio, and then back to Tallahassee. That's the 4 corners of the city of Jerusalem laid out on earth, just for the size of what he's seen coming out of heaven. If you think about it in the European way, it would be Jerusalem to Rome to London and then St. Petersburg, Russia, and back around. That's how big this city is. If you drive all the way around it, it would take you 3 days and 9 hours just to drive all the way around it. Huge. All right, maybe that's not enough for you. Let's do another example. The largest city in the world would be New York City. Maybe you've been there, right? And you think of New York City and the metropolitan area, not just Manhattan and Brooklyn and Queens and Long Island and New Jersey and the entire metro area. It's the largest in the world. All right. It is that city of the New York metro area is 3,352 square miles. Okay. What's heaven? Well, we just laid out what heaven was as a city. Well, heaven is 1,904,000 square miles, or 568 New Yorks when you stack it up all side by side as you laid it out. So that's a pretty big city. But we forgot that it's as tall as it is wide and it is long. So now you have to stack them up this way, along with going this way, to be able to get your full city. And if you do it that way, you have 2,333,000 New Yorks. Doesn't mean very much, but it gives you just this idea of the grandeur and the size of a place filled with the glory of God that you get to dwell in for eternity. I did one more little calculation of the math. Imagine if you were to walk all over the surface of the earth, and you walk every square foot. Well, one, it seems like that's going to take an eternity by itself, right? Because that's a lot of square footage on this earth to walk around. Well, if my math is correct, and you can challenge me to run the math yourself if you want, but if my math is correct, heaven would have 140 times the square footage to walk that earth would have, by just looking at this example that John sees. Again, it's just a metaphor, but the image that John sees as heaven is coming down is this great, giant city full of the radiance of God, full of the saints and the redeemed that he's going to dwell in eternally, that you can explore all around. Think about that. There's so many parts of heaven. It's this great city. It's not going to be boring. It's not going to be dry. You're not going to just be sitting in one place forever. It's humongous is the idea. And it just got me kind of excited just thinking about that. I mean, you just think of what the vision John's trying to see and what you're supposed to be taking away from it. And he gives you so many descriptions of just how big it is that completely passes by if you don't take a moment just to sit and say, all right, that is huge. So now you know. That's my encouragement to you tonight, is just to look at heaven and be impressed by this image. And I hope what that does for you is makes you say, I really want to see what John saw. Because that's the image I came away with, is, well, whatever that is must be pretty impressive. Whatever that is has to be absolutely amazing, and I want to go see it, just like John did, because I won't be able to get the image. I can try it in my mind thinking of stacking all the New Yorks on top of each other. That doesn't get me very far. I mean, it gets me a little bit closer, but not very far. But I really, really want one day to be able to see what John saw in Revelation. So I hope that you do too. Hope that fills you up with enough juice as we go throughout this week and just encourages you more and more to make heaven that priority and that goal, so we can go see what that heavenly kingdom is like. So So that's my encouragement to you this evening. If you need the prayers of the congregation, whether that is to be baptized this evening for the remission of your sins, we offer that invitation to you now. Or if you just need the prayers and the encouragement of the congregation here, we're all trying to get to that city together. We're all trying to get to heaven. So I'm here to support you. Everyone's here to support each other as we try to make it to that wonderful, ginormous city one day. So whatever your need may be, please come forward as we stand and sing this invitation song.